I'm Holly Light, the former regional administrator for New York and New Jersey for HUD. And thank you, really. It is very gratifying to see so many people who care about this important issue. I want to start by thanking the Community Preservation Corporation team that put this whole event together, Jamie Chirac, Eric Biederman, Rachel Robinson, and Athena Johnson. This is all them and none me, so thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And I also really want to thank the three people who made it possible for me to take 4 months to do this full time. Borough President James Otto, and the CPC President Rafael Sestero, and my husband Adam, who's here as well. Thank you to all of you for making this possible. And I also want to thank an amazing group of readers. I'd like to believe that my first draft was decent, but I had readers who are really experts on this issue, gave me incredibly thoughtful feedback and made this so much better. They're all acknowledged in the end of the paper, but really could not have done this without them. So thank you to all of you, and to the many people who are also listed there, whose wisdom over the last 3.5 years that I've been working on this has just been incredible to me. All the meetings, all the conversations I've had, so many smart people thinking about and working on these issues. And so, as I say at the end of my paper, there are no villains in disaster recovery. It's a process that needs to improve, but this is such a smart, dedicated group of people. And I thank all of you for sharing all of your insights with me as I've been working on this. So why did I write this paper? Well, in the 3 years that I was working on the Sandy recovery at HUD, I feel like at least once a week, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, somebody said, we got to get all this down. We have to get all these lessons learned on paper. And we all said, yeah, we really do. And then I was coming to the end of the Obama administration, and we had not yet done it. And I realized I had the luxury of losing my job on January 20th, so maybe I should be the one to do it. And I think part of the reason there is so much knowledge that has been gleaned by experience, but this is also something that's eminently solvable. This is not tax reform, this is not health care. This is a pretty nascent area, disaster reform and disaster recovery, and there is not so much bureaucracy that we can't untangle it. And so I think what I hope you'll see today is, these are things, some of these things can get done this afternoon. Some of them are definitely bigger lifts, but this is something that we can actually accomplish without our heads exploding. And we need to, more importantly. So a couple caveats about today. This is going to be a little bit of inside baseball. So I think most of the audience is pretty familiar with disaster recovery, but there will be, with 50 pages and 3 hours and change, it's just not enough time to do a lot of background. So it's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster ride, so just prepare yourself for that. Also, my paper is not the definitive tome. I kept having people saying to me, how's your book coming? And I kept saying, not a book, not a book. This is a report, a white paper. It's a start. It's, I think the best advice I got is write about what you know and what you experienced, and that's obviously going to be mostly about the perspective through HUD. I touch on FEMA, I touch on SBA, I touch on the experience of the grantees, New York, New Jersey, and New York City, but it comes through the lens of what I know best. So somebody else is going to take the baton, hopefully, and go into other directions on a lot of these issues that I touch on, but there's much more exploration that needs to get done. So the title, why did I call it this? Well, if you've worked in disaster recovery, this is a very familiar phrase. We're building the plane while it's in flight. And I would hear that bandied about all the time. When I went down to New Orleans, the Katrina folks said that, we said it up here all the time. And it makes sense because disaster recovery, the scale and frequency of disasters is unprecedented. And we don't have a book written on this necessarily. But that being said, Katrina was 12 years ago, and we're coming up on the 5th anniversary of Sandy. Enough time has passed that we really can't afford to keep building the plane while it's in flight. And so that is why I think it is necessary that we rebuild the plane now, before the next Katrina, before the next Sandy. Let's make these improvements so that we don't find ourselves in the midst of that again. There's no question Sandy went a lot better than Katrina, and part of that was because of President Obama's task force. Some members are here from that task force. It came up with 69 recommendations, and those were implemented and made Sandy a lot better. But we're making incremental change in an area where we need to be making drastic change and fast change. We're spending so much money on disaster recovery. So these are just some figures. Between 2005 and 14, we were spending $27.7 billion on average annually. That number clicked up between 2011 and 2013. It went up to $45.3 billion for that increment. So we're pouring money every year into recovery, but we're not spending as much time thinking about mitigation. I'm not going to talk as much about preparedness as I am about recovery, but it's just as important. This mitigation saves $1.2 billion annually. This was from a report by the GAO. Every dollar spent on mitigation saves $4 in recovery. So this is really a two-pronged story. We need to be doing disaster recovery more efficiently and faster, but we also need to be really prioritizing preparedness and mitigation as well. So where does this story start? The story of recovery starts, to lay the stage, with this, what I call the alphabet soup of the federal agencies that are involved. I'm going to focus, and in my paper I focus mostly on kind of the two biggest areas that funding went to. Housing and small business, which is kind of individual assistance to victims, and then the larger infrastructure, public facilities. This is money that tends to go to states and localities for recovery. So, as victims will tell you, they have to navigate, at a minimum, 3 agencies. There's FEMA, which is kind of the #1 agency in disaster recovery. It was established in 1979, and basically FEMA is responsible. They have authority through an act of Congress to hit the ground running and start spending money right after a presidentially declared disaster. They also are responsible for bringing all of the federal agencies together and coordinating the response. They do both individual assistance and public assistance up to certain capped amounts. So FEMA comes in, and their money starts in addition to any insurance money. And one of the big things, FEMA actually administers the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Let's just call it a disaster and move on. It is not all, I think it was created by Congress, recognizing that a lot of places in the country that needed flood insurance couldn't get flood insurance. But the problem is it has been drawn on so much because there have been so many flooding disasters. It is greatly in the red, and because there are politics involved, people don't want to actually have the rates be what the market would call for. So we're in a pretty big pickle when it comes to insurance. So insurance, let's just say, is not the whole solution, and it's actually a relatively small part of the solution. FEMA comes in. After FEMA, there's the Small Business Administration. They do not just give loans to small businesses, they also give loans to housing and for housing repairs and housing replacements after disasters. So these are low interest, but they are loans with interest. So these are kind of your two first things after insurance. You're getting a loan and you're getting some funding from FEMA that tends to be usually grant money. Is HUD involved? Well, maybe, you won't know. We'll tell you later. This is one of the big complexities. HUD has been used since 1992 through its traditional Community Development Block Grant Program as kind of we need a way to get more money to people. How do we do it? Oh, here's a program. Let's use that one. And it isn't a perfect fit, and HUD does not have authority to just grant money after a disaster. It actually has to be appropriated through a separate process by Congress after a specific disaster. So in the case of Sandy, that took a whole year from the day of Sandy before the money was in New Jersey and New York State and New York City's hands ready to spend. So if you're a victim, you're sitting there on day one, you're looking at your options, and maybe you have this option down the road, but you don't know. And so this creates a lot of complexity, and when the HUD money did come in, then people we're sitting there thinking, should I have gotten this loan? Now I have grant money. Now I have less grant money because I got a loan. So this whole system of having all these agencies creates a lot of heartache and much more complexity for a victim who was already facing an emergency situation in their lives. It's similar on the infrastructure side. There's all of these agencies that are funding large infrastructure projects. States and cities are trying to figure out how to cobble that together and reconcile different regulations and different funding sources. It's super complicated, and we have not made that as easy to do as it needs to be. So, I'm going to shift to some of the recommendations. I'm not going to talk about every one of these in detail, and a lot of them will get fleshed out more in conversations. But what I've tried to do is group these kind of by the easiest, the things that we can pick up and do right now, to some of the ones that are more complex. The first one is improving communication. This seems elementary. Of course, everybody should be communicating well. But it's one of the things that we heard the most complaints about from victims after Sandy, is that the communication was inconsistent and even inaccurate that they were getting in the days and weeks after. So this first one, post-disaster communications with victims and the public must be comprehensive, accurate, and consistent. Again, seems elementary, but it's so fundamental. A lot of people were told you have to get an SBA loan if you want to get grant money later. That turned out not to be accurate, and it created a lot of inequities between the people who took SBA loans and then got smaller grants, and people who didn't take the initiative to go out and start repairing their house, and they got bigger grants. So this is a big one. If that had been communicated accurately, it would have helped clarify a lot of things. Doesn't mean it would have made everything seamless among those three agencies, but at least victims would have known what they were dealing with when they were making early decisions. The public outreach, the third one, this is another huge one. I think all of the grantees of Sandy would say that if they had to do it again, they would have spent a little bit more money up front to get that right at the beginning. If you don't do this right, it comes back later because you haven't captured everybody. A lot of the people that are most in need of that aid don't know how to access it. They don't know how to go into government programs. So that's a huge one. I think Christy Peel will talk more about this in our panel. The last one, the victims and the public must be given realistic timeframes. This is huge. When we were faced, I think we were about at the third anniversary of Sandy, maybe the second, hadn't had any homes completed. There's a lot of, head scratching about why is this taking so long? I was talking to a consultant who had done a lot of work in a lot of disasters and said, if we ran the perfect housing program, how quickly would it get up and running and money would start to flow? Without pause, he said 18 months. And I thought, well, that certainly isn't what people are being told. So I think 18 months as the gold standard is absurd. We can all agree on that. That being said, until we have fixed this process, victims need to be told realistic timeframes. They're making life decisions, and I can't tell you how many people said to me, if only someone had told me right now, when I started this, that 18 months was the gold standard, I would have done things completely differently. I wouldn't be living in a trailer in my front yard. I would have found an apartment. We owe that at a minimum. Until we get this right, we at least owe the truth to people, as difficult as that can be to tell people. Building relationships, another one. Let's start it this afternoon. A huge one. Sandy's regional interagency collaboration model. This is something that I was very involved in. A lot of people in this room were involved in. I think this should be a model for all future disasters. It grew out of President Obama's task force to bring regional coordination among the federal agencies with the states and the city into a monthly meeting. At the beginning, I'll admit, there was a lot of skepticism. Irene Chang-Semino, who is here, was our fearless leader that brought HUD and FEMA together and kind of started this process. What we ended up doing at the beginning was having, let's call it 60 people in the room from all different federal agencies, from the grantees. And at the beginning, all we did was talk about, this is what our agency's mission is. This is what we do. This is how our funding works. This is our mandate. And what we realized is we didn't know this about each other. And so suddenly, the Army Corps is looking at HUD saying, oh, really? That's how it works for you? And we started to realize that we could start to flag where we were going to have conflicts down the road pretty quickly. This eventually led to a lot of teams being created out of this, a federal review and permitting team that could flag potential permitting issues on infrastructure projects early so that those could be avoided later. We created technical coordination teams of federal experts who could sit with the grantees and say, this is going to be an issue, you should figure this out now so we don't have to deal with it when you're in your environmental review. I think we all agreed that this both created relationships that made things easier to troubleshoot when we had trouble, but also expedited the infrastructure projects. The third one here, the informal CDBGDR guidance. So I mentioned that this is the vehicle, the CDBG, disaster recovery money, is this kind of square peg round hole funding source that is used for disaster recovery. I heard a lot from grantees that it's great to have grant compliance, and it's great to have people who can tell you, yes, you're complying with your grant, but they really wanted somebody who could just sort of whisper in their ear, like, you might not want to do it that way. And that's a more informal advisor role that HUD has not really traditionally played that much with grantees in our regular grant programs. But I think disaster recovery is an area where, unlike all of our other grant programs where the cities and states know it better than we do almost, in this case, you're new to recovery, and we get that, and HUD probably knows a little bit more and can give more guidance informally. And it has to be informal because there's a real fear of, we don't want to tell you something we want to do and then have reprisals later when you come back and give us a finding when you're monitoring it. So there needs to be a little bit of a firewall for HUD to be able to be a little bit more involved, hands-on, giving informal advice, and helping expedite the process and share its knowledge without it coming back in the compliance process. This may be my favorite one. We're starting to get into something that might require a little more expense, a little bit more logistics, but these are fundamental. The first one, if I think there's one recommendation in here that I would say is the most important to start on, it's creating a single disaster relief website and a common application. I went through last year the process of applying to colleges with my stepdaughter. Somehow thousands of universities have figured out how to have a common application for kids to apply to college. I think the federal government can figure out how to have a single common application for victims to apply for aid relief. You should not, as a victim, when you've lost your home, have to sit there thinking, okay, I take $30,000 from FEMA, and then I'm going to take a loan from SBA for this amount, and then if the grant money comes in, I'm going to get this much, but there's duplication of benefits, so I'm going to have to. That's ridiculous. We should not be asking victims to have to cobble together these programs. They should be able to go through one system. They become part of a database. Once they're in there, they give as much information as they can about their situation, and the government is figuring out how to put together an aid package. Now, one big issue with this is privacy laws. Federal privacy laws are intense, but if you just check a box, which we can easily do on a common application, an applicant can say, you can share my information with any disaster relief agencies, including at the state and local level. That would mean you'd only have to put that information in once, and all those agencies could create an agreement to share that. This is what we should be doing. Again, feels pretty fundamental, pretty elementary, but is so essential to making that process more seamless for the victims who are really the ones that we should be serving the most. The last one I just want to touch on, and this is similar to what I was talking about informal advice. HUD does have an online toolkit for grantees to learn about the DR program, but I think we can really beef this up if we bring grantees together and really talk about what were the big threshold issues. This doesn't have to be prescriptive and say there's one way to do it, but what it can do is say, here are some pros and cons of different approaches to setting up a housing program. Here's why you might want to consider having a single relief office rather than having this spread among many offices. And put that in there so that all of those hard issues, there's information that they can think through, look at the pros and cons, look at past case studies of ways that worked and didn't work, point out pitfalls. And again, with that also, many grantees now have created expenditure tracking systems. They do it from scratch every time. They spend a lot of their administrative money doing that. We now have some really good ones out there. HUD should be offering the vetted system to those grantees the day they get their allocation that they can modify and make it work for them. But let's take advantage of all of this expertise that's gone into and this experience that's gone into the past disaster recoveries. Oops. Staffing for success. This is a big one. I mentioned the single office in charge of disaster recovery. I think this is a big one that HUD recommends that grantees, when they get their CDBGDR money, create one office that's doing everything. Don't try to have this cobbled together among a lot of agencies. If you have the same person who is in charge of that, who has executive authority from a governor or a mayor, who basically is calling the shots on programs as well as on budget, I can tell you from experience it goes a lot faster. Decision making is faster. You can get through things just more quickly if that's all part of a full-time disaster recovery office. On FEMA's, at the top, I'll touch on this briefly, we may get to this more later. There is a process now, protocol to open joint field offices after disasters. I think those are really useful. They bring together in a place-based way people from all the relevant federal agencies. I think those are really important for the first, say, 6 to 12 months. Whether those need to continue for years out, I think is another question. And I think maybe instead of having those physical offices, using that SIRC model more effectively throughout might be a good way to transition from the needs of having everybody in one place to actually having people back in their offices so they're feeding real-time information back into the interagency group. Refining housing assistance, again, one of the most complicated and visible aspects, with reason, of a disaster recovery. We'll talk about this more later, I know, but and it's a little controversial, but I think I have come down on the side that housing programs should have income caps on them. Most of them in the past have had income caps on them, and I think that overall, if this is kind of a taxpayer, I'll play the part of the Republican in the room for a second, if you have the resources to recover, should the government be giving you grants to recover? This is such an expensive process, and I think with such a limited finite pie, we should be prioritizing those who really have no other resources to recover. It also would probably mean that more funding would go to public housing than certainly did in Sandy. I think down in Katrina, more went to public housing, but they had a lot more resources than we did on another front that I'll get to. So I'm happy to debate this, but I think it's an important thing to think about. The third one I want to, this I got straight from New York State. Thank you, Lisa. One of our biggest things that I still don't have an answer to is it better to have a homeowner-driven repair program or have the state or city run that for you? I don't think that there is a definitive answer. There's a lot of pros and cons. This is a great place for that decision tree to come into play that I mentioned earlier. But what New York State did is they had a homeowner-driven program, but later, they also procured some of their own contractors for what they called a hotspot program, which meant for people who were having problems getting through. Maybe they had special needs. Maybe they were elderly and just didn't have the capacity to oversee a construction project, which we all know if we've ever done a renovation. This is not easy stuff. So they would pull people into their pipeline by need. The assumption would be you would do it yourself, but then they could identify people who weren't going to get to the end of this process unless they helped them. So I think that's kind of a good hybrid that I would present for future grantees to think about. The last one goes back to that question about people who took SBA loans and then got smaller grants. Not sure that this is the policy answer necessarily, but we did have inequity, and I think maybe there's consideration that should be given to low and moderate income people who took those loans out and then later had hardship as a result of that. Can they use some of their CDBGDR money to repay their SBA loans? The answer today is no, they cannot. And I think that's a question that needs to be thought about more. Trimming red tape, I'm not going to get into these. These are really easy things that we could do again today. Some of these have been done. The tenant-based rental assistance, this is money for people who are displaced. At the beginning of Sandy, that was only available for 3 months. We changed that during the middle of it, recognizing people aren't getting back in their homes in 3 months. And so I think some of these are just permanent improvements that we can easily make without any kind of legislation or even regulation. Streamlining regulatory requirements. This is a big one, and I know the 2 states and city will love this one, all of these particularly. One of the big things that came up a lot is if you got FEMA money, if you got Army Corps money, you have to put in a 10% match. So the state of New Jersey would have to find 10% of the money for a capital project somewhere else other than FEMA or other than Army Corps. HUD allowed that money to come from their CDBGDR, but that meant that they had to figure out how to reconcile our regulations at HUD with those other agencies. That's not that easy to do. Should be, isn't. So I think what we came down on, and we did not do this in Sandy because it would require a change, but you really should only have one agency's regulations governing these projects. And so if you have 90% of your money coming from DOT or Army Corps or FEMA, let those regulations and those laws trump the other agencies. And I think that that's something we just simply have to do to expedite these projects happening. These others are similar along that line. I love NEPA, I do. I started as a historic preservation lawyer. I love those laws. But wow, they really had unintended consequences in Sandy. And so my last thing, again, a controversial one, but I think NEPA was a requirement in the statute. We could not give relief to environmental reviews as an agency easily. But I think in the future there needs to be thought about giving an exception that if you are just repairing or replacing your exact home, it's not a historic home, it's not an environmentally sensitive home, let them do that without an environmental review. And I think that's something that really needs to occur in the legislation at the outset. Providing the right resources. Again, we're getting a little more complicated, a little bit more money, but this is a big one. I went down to New Orleans, and one of the big things that they had in New Orleans that we didn't have were additional resources of housing vouchers and low-income housing tax credits. What they were able to do with those was huge. Housing vouchers on a good day are so hard to come by. In New York City, the waiting list for vouchers is about 200,000. So if you have a disaster and suddenly have a lot of displaced people, it's not like you can tap on an existing resource. Down in the Gulf Coast, Congress provided additional new permanent housing vouchers to help immediately house people that were displaced. That's a huge benefit where they can just go and find a new apartment with that voucher and you house them much more quickly. We did not get that kind of resource in Sandy. Another one is low-income housing tax credits. This was a huge thing in New Orleans. This came later, but they were able to pair housing tax credits, which essentially, without a housing tax credit, you're not going to build new affordable housing, rental housing. It's just necessary for the financing. You can't do it just with cash. So here we had the cash, but we didn't have the tax credits. So what ended up happening is New Jersey had money for new multifamily rental buildings, but they had to go to the state and essentially cannibalize the few existing tax credits that the state got every year, as opposed to having additional ones so that they could go beyond what the state's pipeline of affordable housing would have been. In New Orleans, what they did is they said, if you're going to use our CDBGDR money, you've got to pair it with low-income housing tax credits. The Gulf Coast ended up building 30,000 new units of affordable housing thanks to the marriage of those two programs. Up here, New Jersey probably did the most new rental units, but again, it's not anywhere at this level, simply because we just didn't have the extra tax credits as a resource. I think in places particularly heavy rental markets, as the Northeast is, this should be a standard thing that comes with the program. This also enabled New Orleans to entirely rebuild and reposition its public housing portfolio. And they did massive work in rebuilding and repositioning mixed income communities where their public housing had been. Huge success stories down there thanks to the tax credit program. Legislating greater efficiency. So this is probably now at the hardest one because it requires Congress to work together. But I think these are big ones. These both deal with adding some authority to federal agencies, again, something that usually a lot of people in Congress aren't so interested in doing. But the first one is giving HUD standing authority to issue their CDBGDR money right after a disaster. So this could obviously be very expensive. So if you had a major disaster, a Katrina or a Sandy, you probably still need to do the separate appropriation to get enough money, but to have up to some capped amount, let HUD be in the game on day one, so that when disaster victims are looking at their choices, they know when they're making choices at the beginning about whether to apply for a loan, about how much they want from FEMA, HUD money is already in the mix, and they can figure out their relief package, and the government can help them figure out their relief package on day one. I think this would deal with a lot of that unpredictability and inconsistency that victims have to deal with until it's known whether CDBGDR money is going to get appropriated. The second one here, housing and small business loans should be forgivable. This is another one that it would be a big lift to implement this, but there is really a rationale for saying there shouldn't be 3 agencies involved in housing repair and replacement. Can we get all of that authority for the loans, for the grants, for forgivable loans, all housed in one agency, probably an SBA, so that I'm just going to SBA, I'm dealing with one agency, and if I hit on hardship, which often happens, you may be approved for an SBA loan the day after a disaster, but you hadn't thought about the fact that you lost your car and you can't get to your job anymore. Or suddenly you're paying rent for an apartment while you're also paying for your mortgage on a house you can't live in. A lot of hardship comes up, and suddenly someone who has a loan can't pay it anymore. This system maybe would be an answer for how to ensure that if that person hits hardship, they can go back to that agency and say, I need to be shifted to a grant or a forgivable loan. Here's my hardship case. There's not a lot of ability to do that right now because different agencies are dealing with different money. And now I'm going to shift quickly a little bit to the preparedness and to looking forward. And this really focuses a lot on state and local governments because so much of this really does have to happen at the state and local levels. These are pretty obvious. I want to talk a little bit about the second one, prioritizing community planning. This is something that I've read a lot about and seen in North Carolina. In part, this happens most effectively when people have gotten nailed multiple times. It usually takes more than one to really show if preparedness is happening. After Floyd, which was in the 90s in North Carolina, there was a lot done to do community planning and pinpoint houses that shouldn't be in certain areas. And they put together an acquisition program and started cobbling together funds to buy up those homes that were in unsafe areas, such that when Matthew occurred more recently, there was not nearly as much damage. And they also already had where they wanted to acquire homes identified because they had these comprehensive plans, so they could immediately hit the ground running, buy up those homes after Matthew, because they had that in place. And those acquisition plans were there and were ready. That's what we need to be doing now in the Sandy region. Some of this has been done. I give New York City great credit. One of the things that they did in the Edgemere portion of the Rockaways was originally anybody who came in the door, yeah, we'll rebuild your home, and then they said, wait a minute, this isn't the best way. We are putting people back in harm's way. And so the city owns a lot of land in the Edgemere. It's an urban renewal area. So instead they went back to people who were right on the shore and said, look, we'll build you a new home a little further inland on some land we own, but we want to purchase your house and we're going to create a buffer zone to protect this neighborhood. And that is going on right now. That kind of thinking, that kind of forward-looking strategic planning needs to be happening throughout New York City, throughout New Jersey, in all vulnerable areas, and needs to be proactive so that we're not waiting until the next disaster to know where we shouldn't have people live, where we shouldn't have businesses located anymore. On the federal side, we got to figure out these fundamental policy questions. I was talking to Marion McFadden, who's one of smartest people I know in disaster and one of our panelists later. And the question that she said, and she's right, what is the purpose of CDBGDR money? Is it to be like CDBG money where we're helping low and moderate income people primarily, or is it just we need disaster money and this is a resource? These policy questions need to get fleshed out because a lot of the muddled communication happens because we haven't really figured all of these out on a policy level. And that needs to happen. We have the reauthorization of the flood insurance program coming up, I believe, in 2018. Congress is going to have to ask some of these hard questions, and I think this is why the time is right now to be starting to think about some of these important things. Federal agencies have to continue plugging holes in the programs. This has to be iterative. We can't, even if we did all these recommendations now, we can't stop and sit on our laurels. It's an ever-evolving area where we learn more every time we experience it, and we have to keep getting in there and making those changes. One thing that came up in New York City, there were a lot of housing topologies that weren't necessarily on FEMA's radar screen from some past disasters. How do you deal with attached homes? What do you call mitigation for multifamily buildings that can't elevate? What is partial mitigation? Can you give them credit on their insurance for partial mitigation? All things that FEMA and the city started working on, and that FEMA's looking to update some of its regulations in response to. And finally, we need to prioritize mitigation at the federal level too. If an infrastructure bill happens, God willing, it should require that there is resilient rebuilding as part of getting those funds. Resiliency may not be everyone's favorite word anymore, but disasters are going to happen, so then let's call it mitigation. There needs to be protections that are required in any of this infrastructure money. We have to take advantage of every opportunity we can to be protecting our vulnerable and at-risk areas. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. 41 recommendations that I've grouped together. I know that was a lot, but I wanted to at least set the context. As I said, a lot of these we'll delve into in more detail shortly. There's a lot here, I know, but as I said, a lot of these are cost neutral or not that much money, and they're doable. They're doable. These are things that we can do. We are not so stuck in the bureaucracy of these, and there are people at all the agencies that are so smart. Again, I can't stress enough that this was some of the smartest people I've ever worked with in my career that are looking at this, and everyone's heart is in the right place. I know that there's not a single person who doesn't take figuring this out personally, and I think that's what is needed to get it done. This report is not an indictment of any agency or anyone. It's everybody's intentions are good. We have to fix the system, and I think that we can do that with leadership and prioritization. So thank you for your attention on this.